In 1947, a member of the Japanese Diet drove out to a house in Tokyo that belonged to a prince of the imperial family and offered to buy it. The prince was not in a position to refuse. 2 years earlier, the war had ended. The American occupation had abolished the nobility, and the new property levy on large estates was calculated at rates that no aristocratic family in Japan could pay in cash. They could pay in land. There was one buyer with money. Over the following years, the same man bought a series of princely estates and imperial villas across Tokyo and the surrounding hills, and he turned them into hotels. He called the chain Prince. Most visitors assume the name is decorative. It is not. It is a description of who used to own the ground. By 1987, his son was named by Forbes as the richest man in the world, with an estimated fortune in the region of $16 billion, built on railways, ski resorts, a baseball team, and more golf courses than any other individual alive. In March 2005, that son was arrested. 3 months earlier, the railway company at the center of the empire had been thrown off the Tokyo Stock Exchange after more than half a century of trading. To understand how a family goes from buying palaces to being delisted, you have to understand a single idea that Japan believed for 40 years, and that this family believed more completely than anyone else in the country. The story begins on a farm in Shiga Prefecture with a boy whose father was already dead. Yasuji Tsutsumi was born in 1889 in a village near Lake Biwa. His father died when he was an infant. He was raised largely by his grandfather on a small holding that produced enough to eat and not much else, in a part of Japan that had produced merchants for centuries and had almost no other route out. He worked. He got to Waseda University in Tokyo, studying politics and economics, and graduated around 1913. He was not from the class of people who ran Japan. He was from the class of people who supplied it. What he understood, early and completely, was a piece of arithmetic that his contemporaries treated as marginal. Land that nobody can reach is worthless. Land that can be reached is worth a great deal. The distance between those two states is one railway line, and the person who builds the railway can buy the land beforehand. This was not an original insight. Kobayashi Ichizo had already done a version of it in Osaka, buying farmland along the route of the Hankyu Railway and selling houses to the people the railway carried. But Tsutsumi took the model and pushed it into places nobody else considered developable. In 1920, he founded the Hakone Land Company, and he began buying mountains. The first target was Karuizawa. Karuizawa sits at about 1,000 meters in Nagano Prefecture at the foot of Mount Asama, which is one of the most active volcanoes in Japan. Asama had erupted catastrophically in 1783, killing well over 1,000 people and burying the surrounding countryside under lava and ash. Large areas of the plateau were, more than a century later, still essentially rock and scrub. Foreign missionaries had begun summering there in the 1880s because it was cool and it reminded them of somewhere else. A small European-style community existed. Otherwise, it was volcanic wasteland at agricultural prices, and Tsutsumi bought it in enormous quantities. Then he built the roads, the villas, the golf courses, and eventually the hotels, and he sold plots to the Japanese elite as summer residences. Within a generation, Karuizawa was where the wealthiest families in Japan spent August. Within 2, it was where a future emperor met his future empress on a tennis court. The same decade, west of Tokyo, he bought farmland and built a planned garden suburb around a university campus, laid out on a radial grid with wide tree-lined avenues. He called it Kunitachi. He ran a rail line to it. Then came the first of Japan's 20th century catastrophes. On the 1st of September, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake destroyed most of Tokyo and Yokohama and killed over 100,000 people. In the aftermath, land came onto the market from owners who needed cash immediately. Tsutsumi bought. There is a nickname that attached to him around this period and never came off. In Japanese, it is Pisutoru Tsutsumi, Pistol Tsutsumi. Accounts differ on exactly why. What is not in dispute is that he acquired a reputation for tactics that other developers considered beyond the line, and that he did not appear to mind. By the end of the 1930s, he had assembled land holdings across Hakone, Karuizawa, the Izu Peninsula, and western Tokyo, and had bought his way into the railway business. Then the war came and destroyed the value of almost everything he owned, and it made him. In 1945, Japan surrendered. In the years that followed, the occupation authorities carried out a restructuring of Japanese society more radical than anything the country had experienced since 1868. Three of those measures mattered enormously to one man. The first was the abolition of the peerage. The 1947 Constitution eliminated the kazoku, the hereditary aristocracy created in the Meiji era. 11 collateral branches of the imperial family lost their princely status and their state support in a single administrative act. The second was the capital levy, a one-off tax on large accumulations of wealth imposed at rates that reached the high 90s at the top of the scale. It was designed by the occupation to break the concentration of assets that had underwritten the war. The third was inflation. Japanese prices rose so violently in the immediate post-war years that cash savings were annihilated. Put those three together and you get a very specific situation. Several dozen of the wealthiest families in Japan were sitting on some of the most valuable real estate in Tokyo, had just lost their status and their income, owed a tax bill they could not pay, and were watching their bank balances evaporate. They had to sell. Almost nobody had money to buy. Yasujiro Tsutsumi had money because he had spent the war years in businesses that generated cash and had positioned himself accordingly. He bought the Takeda estate in Takanawa. He bought Kitashirakawa land. He bought imperial villas at Karuisawa and Hakone. He bought grounds in Shirokane and Meguro that had been closed to ordinary Japanese for the entirety of their existence. He put hotels on them. The Takanawa Prince opened in the early 1950s. Others followed through the decade. The name was not a flourish. It was, in a country that had just watched its aristocracy dissolve, a very deliberate statement about who now held the deed. At the same time, he consolidated his railways. The Musashino Railway and the old Seibu Railway were merged into a single company in 1945. Seibu means literally Western Musashi, the western side of the Tokyo Plain. Its lines ran out from Ikebukuro and Shinjuku into the suburbs that Tsutsumi had spent 25 years buying. And in 1953, he was elected Speaker of the House of Representatives of Japan. He now had land, rail, hotels, and the legislature, but the land was the point. Everything else was a machine for making the land worth more. The 1950s and 1960s in Japan were a period of growth without any real precedent in the industrial world. Gross domestic product roughly doubled and doubled again. Tens of millions of people moved from the countryside into the cities. Every one of them needed somewhere to live, and every one of them needed to get to work. For a man who owned suburban land and the trains that reached it, this was close to a license to print money. It also brought him into direct conflict with the only people playing the same game. The most famous of these conflicts is remembered in Japan as the Hakone Mountain War. It ran in various forms for decades, and it was fought between Tsutsumi's Seibu group and the Tokyo group of Goto Keita, who had built a comparable empire on the southwestern side of Tokyo, and who had his own nickname involving theft. The prize was Hakone, the hot spring region below Mount Fuji, an hour and a half from Tokyo, and the single most valuable leisure destination in Japan. The fighting was not metaphorical. It involved competing bus routes run at deliberate loss, disputes over private toll roads with physical barriers erected across them, litigation that ran for years, and confrontations between employees of the two companies on mountain roads. It reached the courts repeatedly, and it reached the national press regularly. Neither side won outright. Both ended up with enormous holdings in Hakone, which they still have. What it established was the character of the business. Seibu did not compete on service or price. It competed by owning the ground the competition needed to stand on. By the early 1960s, Yasujiro Tsutsumi controlled a private empire of railways, department stores, hotels, resorts, golf courses, and land, and he was one of the most powerful men in Japan. In 1964, the year Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games and the year the first Shinkansen ran, he died. Then his will was read. Yasujiro Tsutsumi had maintained more than one household. He had children by several women, and the arrangement was known within the family and, in general terms, outside it. The eldest surviving son by his legal wife was Seiji, born in 1927. Seiji was, by every account, the intellectual of the family. He had been a communist at university, had a serious literary vocation, and had a complicated and often bitter relationship with his father, whose methods he understood perfectly and did not admire. The third son was Yoshiaki, born in 1934 to a woman who was not Yasujiro's wife. He had been raised close to his father, had gone into the land business directly, and had spent his 20s learning the properties parcel by parcel. The will gave Yoshiaki the core. He received control of Kokudo Keikaku, the private holding company that sat above everything and which, in turn, controlled Seibu Railway. That meant the land, the trains, the hotels, the resorts, and the golf courses. He was 30 years old. Seiji received the department stores, which at the time were the least valuable piece. The daughter and the other sons received portions the family did not reconcile. What followed was one of the strangest arrangements in modern business history. Two brothers who barely spoke, running two separate conglomerates that both carried the name Seibu, competing in overlapping markets for the next 40 years, while Japanese business journalists tried to explain to readers that Seibu Railway and Seibu department stores were not, in any meaningful sense, the same company. But the deeper problem was in the structure Yoshiaki inherited, and it was ticking like a clock from the very beginning. Kokudo Keikaku was not a public company. It was privately held, overwhelmingly by the family and by entities close to it. There were no outside shareholders to satisfy, no analysts to brief, no quarterly disclosure of any substance, and no board that could remove the man at the top. Sitting underneath it was Seibu Railway, which was listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. The listing rules of the exchange required that a listed company's shares not be concentrated beyond a certain threshold in the hands of its 10 largest holders. The point of the rule was to guarantee a real market in the stock. Kokudo's actual holding in Seibu Railway was well above that threshold. The reported holding was not. Beneath the structure sat the asset, and the asset was accounted for in a way that changes everything you understand about the numbers that followed. Under Japanese accounting practice, land was carried on the balance sheet at the price paid for it. It was not revalued. So volcanic scrubland bought outside Karuizawa in 1922, princely estates bought in 1947 during a currency collapse, farmland bought in western Tokyo before the suburbs arrived, all of it sat in the books at its historic cost, which in real terms was close to nothing. Its market value by the 1980s was astronomical. That gap was the entire business. Land carried at nothing could be borrowed against at market value. The borrowings bought more land. The new land pushed prices up, which raised the value of the existing collateral, which supported more borrowing. This works permanently, in one condition: land prices must never fall. And in Japan in the 1980s, essentially nobody believed they could. There is a phrase for the belief, Tochi Shinwa, the land myth. Japanese land had risen, with only minor interruptions since the end of the war. Banks lent against it as though it were currency. Companies bought it as a store of value rather than for any use. In the second half of the decade, commercial land values in the 6 largest cities roughly tripled. At the peak, the aggregate paper value of Japanese land was estimated at several times that of the entire United States, a country 25 times larger. Nobody was more exposed to that idea or more enriched by it than the man who had inherited the largest private landholding in the country. From the late 1980s, Forbes magazine began listing Yoshiaki Tsutsumi as the wealthiest individual on Earth. He held the position, by their calculation, for several years running, ahead of the Sultan of Brunei and well ahead of anyone in the United States. The number was in the region of $16 billion. Some years it was reported higher. It was almost entirely land. What he did with it was build. Prince Hotels expanded into the largest hotel chain in Japan, with properties in the center of Tokyo, on the Karuizawa Plateau, at Hakone in Hokkaido, and along the Izu coast. He built ski resorts, most famously at Naiba in Niigata, which became one of the largest in the country and which was reachable from Tokyo in a couple of hours once the Shinkansen extended north. He accumulated golf courses on a scale that made him, by several reckonings, the largest owner of golf courses in the world. In 1978, he bought a struggling baseball franchise, moved it to Tokorozawa in the Seibu commuter belt, built a stadium at the end of a Seibu line, and renamed it the Seibu Lions. Under managers Hiruka Tatsuro and Mori Masaaki, the Lions became the dominant team in Japanese baseball through the 1980s, winning the Japan Series repeatedly. It was, again, the same machine. The team filled the stadium. The stadium filled the trains. The trains raised the value of the land they ran through, all of which he owned. He became one of the most powerful figures in Japanese sport, deeply involved in the country's Olympic movement. When Nagano won the 1998 Winter Games, the effect on the ski resorts and hotels of Nagano Prefecture and on the Shinkansen line built to serve them was not incidental to anyone paying attention. And he was, by consistent account, intensely private. He gave few interviews. He did not explain his decisions. Executives at Seibu described a company where major commitments were made by one man and communicated afterwards. He had no reason to change any of it. Every year, the collateral was worth more than the year before. In late 1989, the Bank of Japan began raising interest rates to break what it had finally decided was a bubble. The Nikkei peaked on the 29th of December, 1989, and then fell for most of the following decade. Land followed, more slowly and far more destructively. Japanese urban land values did not correct and recover. They fell in 1992 and in 1993, and in every year after that for roughly a decade and a half. In the major commercial districts, they eventually gave back the entire gain of the bubble and more. Some parcels in central Tokyo traded in the early 2000s at a small fraction of their 1990 valuation. For a business whose entire model was borrowing against land, this was not a downturn. It was the removal of the foundation. Golf club memberships in Japan had been sold as tradable financial instruments, with a functioning secondary market and quoted indices. Memberships that had changed hands for tens of millions of yen became close to unsaleable. The index tracking them lost the overwhelming majority of its value over the following years. The ski resorts had been built for a domestic skiing population that peaked in the early 1990s and then fell for 2 decades as the population aged and the young stopped coming. The hotels were competing against a wave of construction that had also been financed on the assumption that the land underneath would rise. And on the other side of the family, the collapse arrived first. Seiji Tsutsumi had done something remarkable with the department stores he had been given as the consolation prize. He had turned them into the Seizon Group, Seibu department stores, the Seiyu supermarket chain, Parco, Loft, Credit Seizon, and the Family Mart convenience store network. He had made Seizon the most culturally influential retailer in Japan, running advertising campaigns that are still studied, sponsoring theaters, galleries, and a publishing house. In 1980, one of his companies launched a private label of unbranded household goods sold in plain packaging on the argument that consumers were paying for logos they did not need. It was called Mujirushi Ryohin, no brand quality goods. The world knows it as Muji. In 1988, at the top of the market, Seizon bought the Intercontinental Hotel chain for a sum above $2 billion. It was close to the worst-timed acquisition in Japanese corporate history. Seizon sold it a decade later at an enormous loss, and the debt taken on to buy it, combined with the general collapse of asset values, brought the group down. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, Seizon was dismantled. Seibu department stores went through restructuring. Seiji resigned, took personal responsibility publicly, and contributed personal assets toward the losses. He then spent the last part of his life doing what he had wanted to do at 20. Writing under the pen name Tsuji Takashi, he published poetry and novels, won major Japanese literary prizes, and became a figure of some standing in Japanese letters, a man who had run one of the largest retail empires in Asia and who was invited to conferences to talk about post-war poetry. He died in 2013. His brother's collapse took longer, and it ended in a courtroom. In 2004, the arrangement underneath Kokudo Keikaku came apart. What emerged was that Seibu Railway's shareholder reports had misstated the level of ownership held by Kokudo and its affiliated entities. The true concentration was well over the Tokyo Stock Exchange threshold. The reports had shown it below. This had not happened once. It had gone on for decades. There was a second problem. Once it became clear inside the group that the disclosure was going to have to be corrected, Kokudo sold a large block of Seibu railway shares to companies in its orbit before the public announcement, and therefore before the share price collapsed on the news. Yoshiaki Tsutsumi resigned all of his positions in October 2004. On the 17th of December 2004, Seibu Railway was delisted from the Tokyo Stock Exchange. A company that had been listed since the 1940s, at the center of a group that owned the ground under a substantial portion of the western Tokyo commuter belt, was removed from the market. In March 2005, he was arrested on charges relating to the false reports and the share sales. He was convicted in October of that year. He received a suspended sentence and a fine. He did not go to prison. The photographs from that period are the ones that circulated most widely in Japan. A man in his early 70s who had been listed for years as the richest person in the world, bowing at a press conference. What was left of the empire was restructured. Seibu Holdings was created in 2006 to sit above the railway and the hotels. To recapitalize, the group took investment from Cerberus Capital Management, the American private equity firm, which built up a large stake and then spent years in open conflict with Japanese management. Cerberus wanted the unprofitable rural lines closed and questioned whether the group should still own a baseball team. Management and a substantial section of the Japanese public treated both proposals as unacceptable. The dispute ran through boardrooms, the press, and a tender offer, and became one of the most public shareholder fights in modern Japanese business. Seibu Holdings relisted on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in April 2014, nearly a decade after being thrown off it. The lines still run, the Prince Hotels still operate, the Lions still play at Tokorozawa. The company is now a normally governed listed corporation with outside shareholders, disclosure obligations, and a board that can remove its chief executive. Which is to say that the thing Yasujiro Tsutsumi built, a private holding vehicle, invisible from outside, controlled absolutely by one member of one family, no longer exists. It was the structure, more than any asset, that was the family's real creation, and it was the structure that did not survive. Take the Seibu Ikebukuro line out of Tokyo on a weekday morning, and you are riding on rails that were laid to raise the value of farmland 100 years ago. The farmland is Nerima and Tokorozawa now. Nobody on the train is thinking about who owned it. Get off at Tokorozawa, and the stadium is a 15-minute walk. The Lions still play there. The name on the front is a corporate sponsor's now. Go to Takanawa, and the Prince Hotels are on the slope above the station, on ground that belonged to a prince of the imperial house until a tax bill arrived that he could not pay. Go up to Neba in February, and the lifts are running, and the resort is quieter than it was in 1990, because the country has 3 million fewer people under 20 than it did then. And then go to Karuizawa in August, when Tokyo is unbearable and the plateau is 10 degrees cooler, and walk out past the old villas into the lava field at the foot of Asama. The rock is still there. Black, broken, unfarmable. Exactly as it was when the mountain put it there in 1783, and exactly as it was in 1922, when a 33-year-old from a farm in Shiga stood on it and bought as much of it as anyone would sell him, because it was the cheapest land within reach of Tokyo, and he had worked out that cheapness and worthlessness are not the same thing. It is now among the most expensive ground in Japan. The company still owns a great deal of it,